Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes. Curious Naked Diatribes.
Welcome back to Curious Naked Diatribes. In our last episode, we began a conversation with Dr. Chenzira Kahina, Director of the Caribbean Studies Association. If you'd like to go back and start with that episode, I'll leave a link in the show notes. Dr. Chen described this particular part of the world known as the Virgin Islands as a lotus with its petals unfolding before us as we discover its many wonders. Today we continue this exploration with a discussion of influencers, not the ones on Twitter or Instagram, but rather people either born in or having a connection with the Virgin Islands who went on to make an impact in North America.
You find Virgin Islanders have influenced and contributed to high-level achievements around the globe. And in North America, whether it's Canada, Alaska, or the 48 contiguous U.S. states, I would like to give four because I'd like to share two women and two men. And I would like to start with Hubert Harrison in terms of a 20th century thinker, philosopher, historian, author, publisher, and an activist, right, in the early part of the 20th century, coming from very humble beginnings in St. Croix and left here as a teen, moving into adulthood, but as a teen, and ended up and contributed significantly to the, quote, Negro Renaissance, Harlem Renaissance. You can read certain places, and this is what I love about the U.S. Once you do something really, really engaging, they call you an American. He was born in St. Croix, and he was born in St. Croix at a time when it was still the Danish West Indies, right? And he, was very instrumental to a lot of the activism, a lot of labor engagements, was involved in the Communist Party movement until it was clear for him that layer of the left had a tinge of disregard for people of African ancestry, and especially people coming out of Caribbean spaces. And he continued to move in a different direction. Again, his work, his thought process, how he engaged was phenomenal. And I always encourage people, if you're going to speak about the Virgin Islands, you would need to mention someone like Hubert Harrison, because he was a foremost, very futuristic, definitely a man born before his time. And a lot of persons, they don't really have a chance to know the fullness of his work. Like they speak of him as the voice of Harlem radicalism. And he had an opportunity to do a lot. He did like a significant amount of work between, he was born in the 1880s. We just recently, celebrated the anniversary of his birth, April 27th. And then he passed in the 1920s, around 1927, I believe. Right. So I encourage persons, if you're not familiar with the work of Hubert Harrison, it would be to your advantage to learn a little bit more. And many of the works, one of the biographers who, has published the most, and he just became an ancestor last year, and that is Dr. Jeffrey B. Perry, who literally, collected the papers, worked with the family to really hold Hubert Harrison up in the heights. And I can gladly say that for our CSA conference this year, one of the plenaries is around Hubert Harrison and Caribbean radicalism, right? So that's going to be phenomenal with, led by Dr. Carol Boyce Davies of Cornell University. And I always say Dr. Davies is in New York, yes, at Cornell, but she's from Trinidad. So we're bringing the Caribbean piece into fullness. Another person that I always encourage people to be familiar with is, again, another radical thinker and doer, Rothschild Francis in St. Thomas. And Rothschild Francis, again, a very, very similar in many regards to Hubert Harrison as a radical thinker, what people consider radical. I like to use the term revolutionary. He was pushing human rights and civil rights before those terms were common. And again, was penalized for that. I think that's, and erased from, even though we have the Market Square named, people just call it the Francis Square Market, but it's named after a civil rights leader I'm just saying who was before his time, and it's, we have statues there and people, they'll see the birds by the statues, but they don't really know that he was fighting for the rights of Virgin Islanders at a time that it wasn't even popular, and he was self-educated and he wrote these extensive uh, presentations and was quite an eloquent speaker. So I think it's really important, like he did things to challenge, the Navy's occupation of then Virgin Islands in the United States during the transfer of 1917. He, had a newspaper that he contributed within, people forgot, he did congressional legislation work. And again, this is like beginning early years in the 20th century. People, and like you say, Rothschild Francis, people don't know who that is. And I think it's important to know that. And another person, Leona Brady Watson, cultural artivist before we called it artivism. She was an activist. She was the keeper. She was the cultural laureate, if you will, of not just St. Croix, while she's from here, but of the entire Virgin Islands, in terms of, doing work with the Smithsonian and other agencies to sustain the cultural heritage traditions of this space known as the Virgin Islands of the U.S. And again, she is an ancestor as well. However, she did it in a way so that it was in the schools, in the institutions of higher education. And it's at that time, College of the Virgin Islands, now the University of the Virgin Islands, and made sure that this cultural integration went across a number of different disciplines and spaces, in the churches, in our social engagements, in parks, by the waterfront, seaside chats before we called them seaside chats. And she did a lot of activism, whether it was to the UN, US congressional, and again, very engaging in that regard. And then the other sister, which is really from St. Croix, but I speak of her in terms of her, near 50 years of teaching experience in St. Thomas, and I mentioned her earlier, is Marianne Golden Christopher. And people refer, she was an art educator, literally for almost 50 years, probably 50 or more years, before she became an ancestor. And she is was one of the tradition. I still speak of her as, took a second, Bambula Queen. She carried the tradition of who we refer to as Nana or Auntie Clara, Miss Clara, and others. You had Tanti, you had Nene, you had others that were keeping this Bambula tradition. That this music, these African drums, they were banned in the Virgin Islands until like the 1950s, 1960s, because of the kind of power, the kind of communicative strength that this cultural heritage tradition, which is not just the dance, not just the wearing white and shimmering, but there's a historical, spiritual, cultural fusion. The songs that are sung, what the lyrics are sharing in terms of a message of upliftment and resilience and revolution, the type of music that's played, because it's acoustic. It's not like we're trying to plug up. So we're one of the few troops, if we're even in a parade or a juve or a trompe or a moonlight excursion, all the ways we celebrate. When Bambula goes up the road, it's our own living sound and our own voice. We don't amplify, right? Because the whole idea is that it's a community doing this together to bring upliftment and to speak of resilience. And bambulas were used before revolts and revolutions happened. They were used to plan. They were used to gather. They were used to give messages. So there's another piece, and Marianne Golden Christopher shared that quite eloquently all the days of her life on the earth. And are very blessed to have her daughter, Allegra Christopher, continue that tradition, even with all of the resistance that is met with keeping, it's okay if you do the folk dances and, people are comfortable with the music of the Virgin Islands as Kwelde and the dance tradition as quadrille. When you start to speak of what preceded those music and dance traditions, in this case, the bambula or even scratch, then it becomes a little more challenging, and because of its connection to a very free, pre-colonial, indigenous, revolutionary space. And I'll use that term that people get a little nervous with, very African rooted music. And right. So not everyone is ready for that sometimes. So, but it's wonderful. It's wonderful to speak of those four. I respectfully speak of, Rothschild Francis, Hubert Harrison, Leona Brady Watson, and Marianne Golden Christopher. And the list is long. So for persons that want that, I can easily send you any of the resolutions that we've done for Virgin Islands, Outstanding Virgin books called Outstanding Virgin Islanders, like in 2 volumes, and persons who just see what, who these people are, what they contributed, what were the highlights of their life, when did they live. And then there's a lot that you can go to almost any school in the Virgin Islands, and they're named after someone that's either in the Outstanding Virgin Islanders book or someone that has done outstanding things coming out of the Virgin Islands. And they're not always, I want to highlight that, they're not always born here, right? Sometimes they will be born elsewhere, but they may have been raised here, or they may have been raised elsewhere and came here and contributed significantly. So we have several edifices, schools and institutions and businesses and roads named after persons that contributed to the Virgin Islands. But those four, for what you're asking me now, because I'm sure there's people going to be like, you didn't mention. I'm like, I'm going to read it off. I'll get your list. Because, like this year is the 175th anniversary of Virgin Islands emancipation from 1848 to 2023. And they have a list of ancestors. They actually pulled out, it's a little more than 175 though. I noticed that because some people, they put like the husband and the wife, or the brother and the sister, but it'll look as if it's just 175, but sometimes you'll see some doubles. And there's a lot of people on that list. So I don't feel that bad if I list 4 and I forgot some, because in that list of 175, they're missing a lot. There's so much that's been done. And these are people, and I'm speaking of people, those 4 in particular that I spoke of, their contributions, they're considered Harlem Renaissance people. These are people that contributed in the U.S. to the development of the National Caribbean American Heritage Month, which is observed every June for the entire month. And it's a U.S. congressional piece, right? And grounded in the work of the Institute of Caribbean Studies under the direction of Dr. Claire Nelson, it grew up into something even wider. So you had, Dr. Donna Christian Christensen, who was our former delegate to Congress and a medical practitioner. I need to highlight that she's an MD. And she really facilitated these types of observances to show from this very humble space called the Virgin Islands, how Virgin Islanders impacted activity and programs in the U.S. significantly, have ended up, you have people, like Ambassador Todman, who former governor and ancestor as well, Cyril King. The list is long. So, that have contributed to the U.S. coming out of this very powerful space of the Virgin Islands.
I hope you enjoyed part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Chenzira Davis Kahina. You can find out more about her and her work with the Caribbean Studies Association online at caribbeanstudiesassociation.org. I'll also link to Dr. Chen's YouTube channel, AST Speaks, and her personal website, chenzirakahina.com. You can contact Dr. Chenzira at astspeaks@gmail.com. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I hope you'll stay curious and stay tuned. Curious Naked Diatribes is a production of Javi Media. New episodes first and third Tuesdays. You can get in touch through info@javimedia.net. Javi Media.